The text for today kind of led me more down a bit of a biographical road, you might say. So we have a repetitive use of words because John, and some other words that come up quite a bit: witness and testify. Witness and testify. And I was reflecting back on my life at times when I don't know if I was called on to testify in perhaps a more evangelical kind of fashion, but I remember times starting out when I was younger where I was maybe pushed forward initially and then later took on roles for myself. When I was in 7th grade, my family lived in suburban Chicago, and right after Christmas and New Year's, my family relocated to San Diego. The school that I had attended in Chicago was a part of my church that I attended, and so our universe revolved around St. Peter's Lutheran Church in Arlington Heights. And so finding a new congregation in San Diego was really, really important to my family. We tried, I think, every LCMS congregation south of San Francisco and ended up landing at an ALC congregation like Grace at the time. And at our second visit, the big angst was as the oldest, we had moved in the middle of confirmation. Now, if you're a lifelong Lutheran, you know this is an emergency situation where this has to be sorted out and figured out immediately because you are mid-program. We showed up 3 months after our first visit, and just our second visit, we sat down in the pews, and the pastor came up, and I distinctly remember him speaking to my dad and not me, and saying, "We don't have an acolyte this morning. Would your son be willing to do it?" And my dad said, "Sure he would." So I had a tremendous opportunity to be up front right out of the gate. And it was a fascinating experience because I had never done that even in Chicago. We hadn't gotten to that phase yet. So I was like, wait, how? Okay, let's do this thing. And got up there. And while that may not be a super formal witness, there was a sense of doing something physical, doing something that was a part of our faith community in front of others, a demonstration of my faith, perhaps, would be a way to say it. So the fact that I'm here this morning giving the sermon suggests that it wasn't too scarring of a situation, but I remember it in distinct detail still to this point in my life. When I was in high school, my congregation, this also fell into place with today, was having, get this, a stewardship program. Not, just in case you didn't catch the announcement at the beginning, Pledge Sunday is next Sunday. But we were having a stewardship program, and the pastor thought it would be great if some of the high schoolers would visit other high schoolers to talk about stewardship at their homes. Now, any of you who have been high schoolers or have high schoolers know that they are laying around waiting for this opportunity to happen. And so I, with my friend, went around and visited several others, and there was this interesting moment of kind of passing the threshold of the front door. Felt very momentous. Even though they knew we were coming, we had an appointment and showed up and spoke about the opportunities of the church that were coming. These were a lot of different ways in which I had perhaps been nudged, pushed, but as I would get older, there would be opportunities that I would put myself forward for. I remember when I applied to work at Mount Cross Camp here as a counselor the summer after my freshman year of college. I had been thinking of attending seminary, and it seemed like camp was a good place to begin learning those skills, to kind of live into that identity a bit, to learn what it meant to more directly convey the faith to the next generation. There were a lot of things that kind of came together with that, but I will never forget 2 specific events that first summer. The first was the very first night of staff training, the very first night I was there on site. I can still tell you which bunk in which cabin at Mount Cross it was. I was laying there on the bottom bunk, staring at the bottom of the bunk above me, thinking, what have I done? Here I am, okay. And the second time was sitting outside my cabin on the first day of the first week of camp and hearing the dining hall bell ring, which meant that registration was now open and kids would be starting to show up at my cabin with their parents to move in for the week. And I just remember the sound of that bell. I guess I wouldn't say tolling, that sounds kind of ominous, but ringing, it was ringing. Those were moments where I felt kind of the tension of witness and testimony. But as you might imagine, attending seminary kind of was dropping it into a whole nother gear. I remember distinctly that our freshman year, we say junior year, we were the junior ones on campus, so we were junior students in the MDiv program. We were encouraged on Sundays to wear our clerical collars, which this was a new thing for us. It might shock you to know that I didn't roll around like this in high school. That wasn't my kind of fashion vibe. And so everybody then is buying these shirts, and how does this go on, and where's the button, and all kinds of things like this. But one of the things that became immediately clear is that you might not know this, but you stand out in a crowd. When you are in public, if you are at Safeway, if you are walking down the street, and there are people who will cross the street to avoid you. There are people who will make a point to say hello and greet you. It's an amazing kind of opportunity. And even though in our Lutheran tradition in this time and place, we don't necessarily wear these all the time, if I have errands to run after church on Sundays, or if there is a liturgical event during the week, you will see me around town wearing my clerical collar. And it is interesting because it causes people to think for a minute. And it's kind of an interesting way to move through this life when you experience that. I'm mindful when I went on internship that one of the things that my supervisor did, we were in Youngstown, Ohio, and getting further and further east, it's part of a culture where, you wear a tie to go to McDonald's sort of place, which was not really a San Diego kind of vibe, but it's a more formal sort of thing. And so the black collar was worn much more regularly. You would stand out just as much, but it was a much more common experience. But my supervisor thought it would be good for us to do some door knocking for one season before Holy Week. And so we were out and about knocking on doors, greeting people in the neighborhood. And that was yet another level of what it means to witness, to speak about the church and faith at some person's door who wasn't expecting you to come. When I was in my first call, I went through mission developer training, which curiously is not something that every pastor does. In case there's somebody in the Senate office watching, it would be good if they did. But the training is to start a congregation from scratch. So picture being dropped off at a random intersection somewhere, and the assistant to the bishop, who's still idling in the car before they drive away, says, "We're picturing a church about here. Good luck," and drives off. And then it's your job to make it happen. When I was starting in my first call, the first thing I did was I knocked on 1,000 doors in that community. It's a town of about 15,000 people, so that was actually a pretty meaningful slice of the community to go and visit. And throughout my time in Minnesota, people would run into me, "Oh, you stopped at my house." And it was amazing the relationships that were built, this time of witness. It's definitely been a part of the arc of what I do, but even yesterday, stopping at the hospital and visiting Gary, I was not in my collar. It was kind of a last-minute visit, but it was interesting to interact with the staff who were serving Gary, who immediately knew who I was and what my role was in that place. It's interesting in a medical context because they understand who you are as a clergy person. They do a good job, as long as it's not affecting patient care, to make space for pastoral care visits in a hospital context. And that has universally been a positive witness, not just to the patient and the family, but also to the staff who are there that you interact with. Universally great experiences. But when we look at the text for today, what does this idea of witness look like? Should we all be getting fitted for clerical collars and get ready to head on out? I don't know that that's necessarily the best idea. But there are a lot of opportunities for us to witness on a day-to-day kind of basis. And I think that if we think back through the years of the saints of old, we can think of very dramatic scenarios where people have had an opportunity to bear witness, sometimes even with their life. Dietrich Bonhoeffer comes to mind, and there's a great saying about him in recent generations that everybody wants to be Dietrich Bonhoeffer until it's time to be Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who is a famous Lutheran pastor who was martyred at the end of the Nazi regime in Germany. I think in many ways, though, the Holy Spirit is the one who calls us to witness on a daily basis in many and small ways. And we have opportunities all the time. Some of it is simply extending a hand to somebody, holding a door, taking the extra step to do something kind for someone, not knowing the situation that they are in. Wandering through a hospital context really distills this, because you bump into all kinds of people that are in immensely stressful circumstances, and a small amount of kindness goes a long ways. And it's interesting to me, and when we talk about witness and testimony, that it would land on Mother's Day. As we think of this idea of love and how it is shared, it is sometimes about grand gestures, but more often than not, it is reflected upon as a lifetime, an accumulation of small acts of love, perhaps most importantly, when we didn't deserve it. That is probably the hallmark of witness. I remember a time when I was in seminary where we were witnessed to. Our first year of seminary, one of our classes required that we visited a number of faith communities and experience the worship context of those communities. We worshiped at a synagogue, was one. We had worship at the large Greek Orthodox church in Columbus. That was another one. And one of the ones that stood out in my mind was attending a revival being held at an African descent Baptist congregation that was one of the big historic churches in Columbus. And I and a couple of my classmates weren't able to go the evening when most of my classmates went, but 4 or 5 of us went the second evening. And it was fascinating to be in that space because we sat in kind of the middle, but it was probably 500 people. There was not a seat to be had anywhere in this space. As is not unusual in their tradition, there were a couple of women in the back who were nurses who were ready to provide assistance if anyone was overcome by the moment. But the 4 of us were the only ones in our demographic sitting in the pews there. And it was just beautiful the way the pastor welcomed us at the beginning of the service. He said, "I see we have some students this evening from the seminary. Welcome." And it was, hello. But what I was reminded of was all of the blessings that were referenced in the preaching that evening that oftentimes were things from my background that I just kind of assumed. Food, shelter, employment. And in different communities, those aren't the same assumptions. This idea of witness in different contexts can be challenging. Even when I was on sabbatical in Northwest Germany in a parish context for that month, the culture, while somewhat familiar to me, is different enough that I had to do a lot of listening to understand how words and actions might be conveyed in a different cultural context. Every generation, as Christ calls us to testify and to witness the gospel that Christ lives, is the same without time. But the way in which we witness and testify to that gospel changes in every culture and in every generation. I would encourage you, as you go about all of the things that are on your calendar and maybe aren't on your calendar yet for this week, that you be mindful of the small ways in which you are witnessing. And in particular, to keep your heart open for opportunities that Christ may present you that you don't anticipate as you go through your week. Keep your heart open for those opportunities to witness. Amen.